Course content AP Macroeconomics. This is the introductory macroeconomic course. Monitoring the macroeconomy. The chapters are 21, 22 and 23. Chapter 1, GDP, a measure of total production and income. 21.1, GDP, income and expenditure. GDP defined, circular flow in the US economy, expenditure equals income. 22.2, measuring US GDP, the expenditure approach, the income approach, GDP and related measure of production and income, real GDP and nominal GDP, calculating real GDP, using the real GDP number. 21.3, the uses and limitations of real GDP, the standard of living over time, tracking the course of the business cycle, the standard of living among countries, goods and services omitted from GDP, other influences on the standard of living. Appendix, measuring real GDP, the problem with base year prices, value production in the price of adjacent years. Chapter 22, jobs and unemployment. 22.1, labor market indicators, current population survey criteria, two main labor market indicators, alternative measures of unemployment. 22.2, labor market trends and fluctuations, unemployment rate, the participation rate, alternative measures of unemployment, a closer look at part-time employment. 22.3, unemployment and full employment, frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, cyclical unemployment, natural unemployment, unemployment and real GDP. Chapter 23, the CPI and the cost of living. 23.1, the consumer price index, reading the CPI numbers, constructing the CPI market basket, the monthly price survey, calculating the CPI, measuring inflation and deflation. 23.2, the CPI and the other price level, sources of bias in the CPI, the magnitude of the bias, two consequences of the CPI bias, alternative measures of the price level and inflation rate. 23.3, nominal and real values, dollar and cents at different rates, nominal and real values in macroeconomics, nominal GDP and real GDP, nominal wage rate and real wage rate, nominal interest rate and real interest rate. The real economy, chapters 24, 25 and 26. Chapter 4, potential GDP and the natural unemployment rate. Macroeconomics approach and pathways, three main schools of thought, today's consensus, the road ahead. 24.1, potential GDP, the production function, the labor market. 24.2, the natural unemployment rate, the job search, job rationing. Chapter 5, economic growth. 25.1, the basics of economic growth, calculating growth rates, the magic of sustained growth. 25.2, the labor productivity growth, labor productivity, saving and investment in physical capital, expansion of human capital and discovery of new technologies, combined influences bring labor productivity growth. 25.3, economic growth, old and new, old economic theory, old growth theory, new growth theory. 25.4, achieving faster growth, preconditions for economic growth, policies to achieve faster growth, how much differences can policy make. Chapter 26, finance, saving and investment. 26.1, financial saving and investment. Some finance definitions, market for financial capital, financial institutions, insolvency and illiquidity, interest rates and asset prices. 26.2, the loanable funds market. Flows in the loanable fund market, the demand for loanable funds, the supply of loanable funds, equilibrium in the loanable funds market, changes in demand and supply. 26.3, government in loanable fund market, a government budget surplus, a government budget deficit. The money economy, chapters 27 and 28. Chapter 27, the monetary system. 27.1, what is money? Definition of money, the functions of money, money today, official measures of money, M1 and M2, checks, credit cards, debit cards and e-checks. The embryonic new money, e-cash. 27.2, the banking system, the commercial banks, thrift institutions, money market funds. 27.3, the Federal Reserve System, the structure of the Federal Reserve, the Fed's policy tools, how the Fed's policy tools work. 27.4 Regulating the quantity of money. Creating deposits by making loans. How open market operations change the monetary base. The multiplier effect of an open market operation, the money multiplier. Chapter 28 Money, Interest and Inflation. Where we are and where we are heading. The real economy, the money economy, real and money interactions and policy. 28.1 Money and the interest rate. The demand for money, the supply of money, the nominal interest rate, changing the interest rate. 28.2 Money, the price level and inflation. The money market in the long run, a change in the quantity of money, the price level in a babysitting club, the quantity theory of money, inflation and the quantity theory of money, hyperinflation. 28.3 The cost of inflation. Tax cost, shoe leather costs, confusion costs, uncertainty cost. How big is the cost of inflation? Economic fluctuations, chapter 29, 30, 31. Chapter 29 Aggregate supply and aggregate demand. 29.1 Aggregate supply. Aggregate supply basics, changes in aggregate supply. 29.2 Aggregate demand. Aggregate demand basics, changes in aggregate demand, the aggregate demand multiplier. 29.3 Explaining economic trends and fluctuations. Macroeconomic equilibrium. Three types of macroeconomic equilibrium. Economic growth and inflation trends, the business cycle, inflation cycles, deflation and the Great Depression. Chapter 30 Aggregate expenditure multiplier. 30.1 Expenditure plans in real GDP. The consumption function, imports in real GDP. 30.2 Equilibrium expenditure. Induced expenditure and autonomous expenditure. Aggregate planned expenditure in real GDP. Equilibrium expenditure. Convergence to equilibrium. 30.3 Expenditure multiplier. The basic idea of the multiplier, the size of the multiplier and the MPC, the multiplier, imports and income taxes, business cycle turning points. 30.4 The AD curve or aggregate demand curve and equilibrium expenditure. Deriving the AD curve from equilibrium expenditure. Chapter 31 The short-run policy trade-off. 31.2 The short-run Phillips curve. Aggregate supply and the short-run Phillips curve. Aggregate curve demand fluctuations. Why bother with the Phillips curve? 31.2 Short-run and long-run Phillips curve. The long-run Phillips curve, expected inflation, the natural rate hypothesis, changes in the natural unemployment rate, have changes in natural unemployment rate change the trade-off. 31.3 Influencing inflation and unemployment. Influencing the expected inflation rate, targeting the unemployment rate. Macroeconomic policy, chapter 32, 33, 34. Chapter 32 Fiscal policy. 32.1 The federal budget. The institutions and laws, the budget balance and debt, the federal budget in fiscal, a social security and Medicare time bomb. 32.2 Fiscal stimulus. Schools of thought and cracks in today's consensus. Fiscal policy and aggregate demand. Automatic fiscal policy. Cyclical and structural budget balances. Discretionary fiscal policy. A successful fiscal stimulus. Limitations of discretionary fiscal policy. 33.2 The supply side potential GDP and growth. Full employment and potential GDP. Fiscal policy, employment and potential GDP. Fiscal policy and potential GDP, a graphical analysis. Taxes, deficits and economic growth, the supply side debate, combined demand side and supply side effects, long run fiscal policy effects. Chapter 33 Monetary Policy. 33.1 How the Fed conducts monetary policy. Monetary policy objectives, operational maximum employment goal, operational stable prices goal, responsibility for monetary policy, choosing a policy instrument, the federal funds rate, the Fed's decision-making strategy, hitting the federal funds rate target, restoring financial stability in a financial crisis. 33.2 Monetary policy transmission. Quick overview: interest rate changes, exchange rate changes, money and bank loans, long-term real interest rate, expenditure plans, the Fed fight recession, the Fed fights inflation, loose links in long and variable lags, a final reality check. 33.3 Alternative monetary policy strategies. Y rules, inflation targeting rules, money targeting rules, nominal GDP targeting rules. Chapter 34 International Finance. 34.1 Financing international trade, balance of payments accounts, borrowers and lenders, debtors and creditors, current account balance, net exports. 34.2 The exchange rate. Demand in the foreign exchange market, the law of demand for foreign exchange, changes in the demand for dollars, supply in the foreign exchange market, the law of supply in foreign exchange, changes in the supply of dollars, market equilibrium, exchange rate expectations, purchasing power parity, monetary policy and the exchange rate, pegging the exchange rate, the People's Bank of China in the foreign exchange market.